We had some sensational races at Goodwood Imperial. We've had sensational races in the new era, but one of the most sensational was the 1959 TT, which was the climax of the World Sports Car Championship that year. Mega battle between Aston Martin and Ferrari, the lovely DBR1 Aston Martins. Jaguar were there with the Écurie Cross D-types. And the little Porsche RSK, you can see reversing in there. And we are recreating the story of that dramatic race with as many of the original cars as we could assemble. And the DBR1 was the most glorious Aston Martin. Handling was perfect. It had enough power. The only thing that hampered the DBR1 was the gearbox, which the gear change was dreadful. And funnily enough, in recent years, it's been improved enormously, and is a lovely car to drive. D-type reversing into its position.
Yeah, but if you look at that number 6 D-type, on the number 5 DBR1 Aston Martin in the front of the grid, we heard from Darren Turner, that's him, but we just noticed Tom Christensen has got on board the long-nosed D-type. Number 6, that was supposed to be Gary Pearson, but as we know, Gary's just come in from the previous practice session.
He's worn himself out.
And Tom Christensen isn't averse to getting himself into cars, and he understands, obviously, 8-time Le Mans winner, that a car that wins Le Mans is one that he ought to be driving, so he's gone out as well. So let's just reiterate, this is celebrating an event 60 years ago from now. Aston Martin had taken the victory at Le Mans with Carroll Shelby et al., but they were desperate for that World Championship victory in the Sports Car Championship, and the final round was here. And they had huge success over the years in the Tourist Trophy at Goodwood, and they were desperate to land it, but it proved to be an incredibly dramatic race for them.
And it was also a period of revolution among the D-types, the big Astons, the D-types with the little Lotus 15s, much lighter, nimbler 2-litre cars, the rear-engine Cooper Monacos. So things changed enormously towards the end of the 50s.
And also look at the size of the DBR1s, and then you can see the DB3S, which is the third one in the line with the pale blue nose. The Ferrari 250 TR looking fantastic, but the 5th and 6th cars in the line along the pit wall in that echelon formation. They're both small, they're silver, they're German, and they were the little Porsches, the 917, the 718, 917 I think, not the 718 RSK, 2 of them there. Number 30 and 11A, curious numbering system there, but they were small, nimble, and very, very reliable, which really helped them against the grunt of the slightly more fragile Aston Martins.
And the long-nosed D-types, which Écurie Cross took over from the works from one Le Mans. D-type designed really only to race at Le Mans. That was all William Lyons was really interested in. When they went to the Nürburgring, they weren't at all happy. Although, of course, at Goodwood, Goodwood's a perfect circuit for them as well, although we don't have a Mulsanne straight.
So feast your eyes on the pale metallic green Aston Martins. 2 GBR1s, DB3S, which was the forerunner and had gone so well here, 1956, Stirling Moss victorious here in the DB3S, so plenty of success for Aston Martin, often against manufacturers that were sort of stronger, but in the very end of the 1950s, Aston Martin really had momentum with it, but it was so desperate to give David Brown the championship that he craved above all other things.
And Tony Brooks in the DBR1, silky smooth driving, apparently in a higher gear around each corner than everybody else, so it was sensational watching him.
So about to be released, just waiting for Mike with the flag to be given the signal to send them out. She'll be bang on time. And a great array of cars. These are the cars that were represented. It was a 30 car, a 31 car field that went out to play this race, the Tourist Trophy, final round of the World Championship in 1959. Aston Martins at the fore. And the favourite car at the start of the race was the one driven by Roy Salvadori and the great Stirling Moss. That was the car that they were going to hope would land the victory that could take them and nail them to the top of the mast ahead of Ferrari.
There was one privately entered DBR1, Graham Whitehead's DBR1, and the story of what happened, what he did on behalf of Aston Martin has become legend, and the story will be really repeated and revealed through this recreation demonstration of the 1959 RAC TT.
Now, one of the key things, well, not one of the key things, one of the elements at Goodwood is always about recreating the past. And we've even got the same Indian summer weather that they had 60 years ago. Beautiful, beautiful conditions.
And of course, they had a Le Mans start, didn't they? Ran across the track, jumped in, no seatbelts, of course.
And again, among the mix of cars, you can see the Lister Costin going around, one of the shapes out there, car number 41, that's Kurt Engelhorn. And 31 cars came out to play. I haven't really bigged up the Porsches enough because they were right in the World Championship mix as well. It could have been Ferrari, it could have been Porsche, and Aston Martin were hoping it was going to be theirs. And the car started by Royal Salvadori, one of these DBR ones, hared clear at the start of the race. And then it came round, of course, a long race, and there would be driver changes. And it was during one of these driver changes that it looked as though their chances had gone up in smoke. Absolutely, literally. But for now, if you're out around the circuit, enjoy Darren Turner doing what he enjoys the most, driving an Aston Martin, and even more so a historic Aston Martin.
Was it the race? Was it the year that Stirling won Nürburgring in the DBR1, hoiking Jack Fairman out of the car after his co-driver had gone off the road?
They won a lot of races that year, most famously the Le Mans 24 Hours. That I always remember a story that Carroll Shelby told me long ago. He said that he'd been racing in his Texan bib and a tucker, you know, his dungarees, the white with the little blue stripes on them, and he noticed that David Brown, ever immaculate, had changed into another summer suit for the podium ceremony, and he hoiked him into the cockpit of the car and drove around. He knew where he put him was full of oil, been sloshing around for hours.
Yeah.
And David was more concerned with keeping his suit clean than enjoying the accolades around the circuit. So there on the big screen, one of the little 718 RSK Porsches, 58 and 59 models, slightly different. The 1959 model has a tiny dorsal fin behind the driver's head, but that's the 58 car on the screen, and being driven by, I don't know if it's Lee Maxted Page or Robert Westerman, because we're having this display again tomorrow, so we will see what changes around. But as you can see, small, nimble, made for purpose. Not got the engine notes of the Aston Martin, but went about things very differently. And the Porsche of today is very different from the Porsche of then. Porsche feeling its way, but what you always had was exquisite engineering as they started to make their mark felt. And soon, Le Mans was their happy hunting ground.
And robust and reliable as well.
And again, if you look at 11A, slightly different frontal treatment on that. That's the slightly newer one, slightly snubber. More of a snub nose, slightly longer nose on the previous year's cars. That's number 30.
With the twin cam flap 4 behind the driver. Look at the glorious shape of the A Kyrikos D-type, long nose D-type.
So perfect conditions for these cars to be shown off, and hand out of the cockpit there from Tom Christensen. He feels he's got a bit more pace, or he wants to drive a little bit faster in that long nose D-type. Number 6, that Jaguar, just such an evocative shape, and Tom will be enjoying chalking up another car that was capable of winning Le Mans, and just relishing the chance to get a feel for what it was like, because the drivers like to feel the characteristics and specialities, and also the Achilles heels on all of these cars, just to understand the sport better. And if anyone can find it in the space of a few laps, that's your man.
And an hour or so ago, I was talking to one of the drivers in this race who raced a Lotus 15 in this race and retired, and of course it was the great David Piper. He's still going strong. He's not. He's reluctantly given up his license. He's not racing anymore, but he still drives his 917, his 512S in demonstrations. Really enjoys it, particularly in France.
Lovely to have him here, and lovely to have that selection of cars to play. But it must be said, at the end of the event, we started with 31 cars, and we ended up just 14, which was fairly typical of the day. Cars were far, far more fragile, and not many of those had accidents. Some did, but okay, let's cut to the chase. The big problem was for Aston Martin. Roy Salvadori came in for that refuelling stop, and unfortunately his car caught fire and had to be retired from the race. So it looks as though Stirling Moss was over and out, but very kindly, it was all put out. The car continued, but of course he had to jump into another car. Graham Whitehead vacated his garage area, so the pumps could be used, obviously thinking I might get a better Aston Martin next year. But that happened a lot back in period, Chris.
Was it a 1,000-kilometre race here at Goodwood?
It was 6 hours.
6 hours, so
And eventually, no, the winning 224 laps, 537.6 miles was the distance covered. So not 1,000 kilometres, but 6 hours of solid racing. But that big blip for Aston Martin was the pit fire.
On the screen, the revolution from the Costin Lister Jaguar to the little Cooper Monaco, rear-engined. DBR1 just passes the pits, making that lovely straight 6 3-litre sound.
Well, what's happening there now? Winding them up. They've picked up the pace. Tom Christensen's 6th in that line of cars. The 3 Aston Martins at the front, the 2 DBR1s, and then the DB3S. And they're really starting to... It's the sound that really, really gets me all along. Goes up my sternum.
Yeah, it does. That was the final iteration of the DB3S, final body shape. Lots of people will say it's a prettier car than the DBR1. Frank Feely's classic shape with the cutouts behind the front wheels.
Yes, I mean the DBR1 has an aggressive mien that the Jaguar does not have. The Lotus is. Looking at number 70 on the big screen, so much smaller, so much more nimble, so much sleeker. That's Dion Kramer. Again, looking at his Lotus 15, the Climax engine car, totally different way of going racing, and certainly the thoroughbreds from Aston Martin and Jaguar must have felt quite challenged by these little upstarts, if you will, in the Lotus 15s. Doing things very different.
There was a little Lotus 17 in the field as well, and we've got one here. The 17 was never very successful. They didn't like the handling of it.
Part of the problem there was the Chapman strut suspension, which they later put just conventional 11 type front end on it as well. I don't think the chassis was quite stiff enough for it. But yeah, we still see 1 or 2 in the original form, but mainly they were modified in period.
There's James Wood, number 26. He's sharing that car with Queenie Lamont. He's doing the driving today.
That's the ex-Michael Taylor car, isn't it, that raced here?
Quite so. But in fact, just talking to James early this morning, he said the trouble is 2 children entered in the Setchington Cup, and that starts to take over the whole weekend. He said, I can only have time for 1 race. We've got to get those children buffed and ready for their pedal car racing.
Do you get them buffed because they're quicker through the air that way?
Well, naturally.
Absolutely.
Why would you not? Bead blasting, little Dyson bead blaster out. Light them off a bit, but Aston Martin at the front as they were. So recovering from that pit stop, and of course disaster for that particular DBR1, and then Stirling Moss with such a record in the TT, won it so many times across the various venues, but he got transferred into the Aston Martin that had been started by Carroll Shelby and Jack Fairman, and between the 3 of them they went on to take the victory that landed the World Championship for 1959 for Aston Martin. But it was a real case of almost so nearly falling at that final hurdle. But for Stirling Moss, yet another win came his way here at Goodwood, and it was hard fought and very, very heavily celebrated, you can be sure, because all the sweeter when it's nearly been taken away from you and you've clawed it back. But they had a big debt to Graham Whitehead for letting them use his garage, his pit area, to make their further pit stops.
And we're going to recreate this 1959 TT tomorrow at 3:45, on Saturday morning at 11:30, and on Sunday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Don't forget that this evening we've got our first race of the weekend, the fabulous Kinrara Trophy, racing into the dark with some wonderful cars. You may have seen the practice session for them. Short wheelbase Ferraris, Jaguar E-types, Cobras, just about everything, and it's a real treat, particularly on a day like this when the sun goes down and we get sunset and some wonderful photographs.
Well, I think barring disasters, you are set for a brilliant, brilliant sunset. Quite right, Chris, but right now, just a chance to relish these cars that 60 years ago went out to do battle with Aston Martin, hoping that they were the creme de la creme, and they proved to be so. Ferrari are in the mix. There is
250 Testarossa.
250T, oh yeah, absolutely, the Testarossa. Just checking who's on board. That's William Connor. Bill Connor. Looks good, sounds even better, rumbling over the start-finish line. But great to see them running line astern, the 2 DBR1s, slightly earlier DB3S with that pale blue nose marking it out. Then there comes Bill Connor, number 11 Ferrari, and then the car they finished 2nd in the World Championship and 3rd in the World Championship that year was Porsche. So they're running in that order. We've got the Aston Martins, and we've got the Ferrari, and then the Porsches. So nice synchronicity, if you will. And behind them, the cars that ran in the junior classes, if you will, 6th overall in that event. Alan Ross and Peter Ashdown, the American racer and the Brit, winning the junior class for Lola cars, their Lola Climax Mark 1, and we see one, if not two of those, no, in fact two of those cars, we've got a silver one, two silver ones out on the circuit,
Yeah,
much smaller, much nimble.
The dark blue one represents the first car, I think.